Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we're going to be talking a little bit about some of the different types of evidence that we sometimes use to build our understanding of a health-related issue. Now, here I'm going to be focusing in on evidence that's not published by traditional publishers, scholarly publishers. Now, typically when we think about this type of information, we usually don't see these as being evidence that you would typically cite. However, it can be used to build background information in a topic area, and that can be actually quite helpful for developing projects and developing your understanding of a topic area. So first off, let's talk a little bit about popular media, and that's where there is a tremendous amount of conversation about health-related issues. There's general health-related web pages. There's news sites that cover this in various different ways. There's blogs and opinion-related sites related to health. Now, these are not generally seen as being things that we would typically cite. However, they can be actually fairly useful for certain types of background information. For example, there's some general health-related websites like the Mayo Clinic, which are actually quite strong in terms of giving general information about health. Whereas there's other websites which are terrible, like say Natural News or something like that, where the quality is incredibly poor typically. You can also have news sources. So news sources are really great for generating ideas. They can be reporting on publications, on new research findings, but very often news sources don't necessarily represent an accurate picture of what happened in the study. So you really do need to go back to those original studies. But sometimes it's reporting on recent events, for example, a hurricane and the impact on the clinical systems based upon that. So some of these news sources can actually be quite helpful for gaining understanding of what's happening in different health situations. And then there's blog and opinion posts of sites of various sorts. These are, again, subject to tons of bias. But there are some blogs, for example, that are put together by very reputable experts in fields. And they can be very helpful for gaining some of the background information about different topic areas. And often, sometimes you see people's true opinions coming through, which can actually be really helpful for getting a little bit more of an honest analysis of what's going on in certain topic areas. So you wouldn't necessarily want to write this off as something that might be useful for gaining a general understanding of a scholarly area. Now, we don't normally use this information as citations that we use to support practice changes or papers or things like that. But there are some rare circumstances, where that might be useful and appropriate. So, for example, I'm working on a paper right now, which is looking at a new health technology, which there haven't been any publications put out on the use of this technology. However, there are some news articles about that topic area. So I probably will cite some news articles in that paper just because there are other sources to use in the circumstance. So there are exceptions to these rules, but generally speaking, we aren't using these as sources for supporting what we're doing. There's other types of background information that one can get, sometimes in a bit more of a scholarly realm. These would be textbooks, for example. Textbooks present essentially background information about knowledge in that field. Typically, information that's put into a textbook is very well established, right? So it's usually not something that are really clinical questions anymore, because it's usually pretty well developed and based upon a fair amount of evidence. So these are usually not new hot burning issues. These are pretty well settled issues. That being said, textbooks can be great for getting new information about areas where you might not know as much as you would like to, that are relevant to the topic that you're interested in. There's also magazine articles that are from magazines that focus in on health. These tend to be a little bit higher quality than what you might get from general news articles or basic websites. But they don't go through a peer review process, so you can't take them too terribly seriously. but they can be useful for getting some basic background information. And sometimes you'll find things in these magazines and perspectives in the magazines that will actually be kind of hard to find among published literature in the scholarly literature. And then there's things like how-to articles that you might find, which might describe clinical recommendation or suggestions for how to do different clinical procedures or practices. And these can be helpful for gaining knowledge about how to handle different types of situations. Again, sometimes you might cite these things, but it's, textbooks, sometimes you'd cite them in your methods section or for some basic information, sometimes these types of articles, but typically we steer clear of these types of publications for the work that we do. We use them more for getting background information. Then we have scholarship, which or evidence, which falls into an area which is called gray literature, and this is literature that hasn't been published by scholarly journals, scholarly publishers, but that can still be useful for understanding an area, and sometimes can actually be helpful, can actually be appropriate to cite. So these could be reports put out by different community organizations or different health-related organizations, which might not be peer-reviewed or published by a publisher, but can still be helpful for understanding certain issues. So, for example, if you're doing a project in Seattle, Washington, you might want to look at some organizations that are looking at, let's say you're looking at issues related to health issues for homeless folks. You might want to look at some of the reports that different organizations in the area are putting out about their experiences working with that population and different needs that are relevant for that population. Now, that can be actually fairly helpful, and some of that data that you might get might not be something that you could get out of a publication. There's also things like dissertations or abstracts. White papers are similar to reports in that they're sort of like scholarly papers that have been put out by organizations but haven't gone through that peer review process. But they can be quite useful for getting some general information. There's also books that haven't been reviewed sometimes. That can be helpful for gaining information about different topic areas. But if they haven't been reviewed by experts in that field, they aren't really seen as being publications that one would rely upon. There's also sort of what I describe as general government documents, and these are documents that are put out by the government, which might say something about different health-related issues, but aren't, again, peer-reviewed. These publications can vary in quality. Some of them can be truly excellent quality and some of the best information that you can find specifically for local issues. But they will sometimes vary depending on the situation. There's also health associations or health organizations of various sorts. These websites and sources can be quite helpful, but it's important to note that for these health associations, or the American Heart Association or whatever it happens to be, these associations they fund research, they provide helpful information, and it's their goal to educate the public and provide information that scholars can potentially use. But remember that for a lot of these organizations, the data and the evidence that they present may actually overemphasize the impact of that disease or condition, because it's in the interest of that organization to emphasize the importance of what they're working on, right? So there's somewhat of a conflict of interest sometimes in terms of presenting data so if they're choosing between different types of data, they probably will pick data that emphasizes the importance of what they're doing, because that's how they raise funds sometimes. So it's something to just be critical about when you see that type of work. The other types of gray literature that are actually kind of important are what are called clinical trial registries. So when someone goes to do a clinical study, they're now required to enter what they're doing into a clinical trial registry. And so if you're looking at a scholarly area and you're seeing that certain publications, it seems like all the publications that are out there seem to suggest that, say, this drug causes or is helpful for addressing this disease, well, what you can do is you can go to clinical trial registries and see whether there's a lot of studies that have looked at this question but never got published. So that can help you address whether there might be publication bias in that literature. There's also some literature, some information out there, evidence out there that actually comes from really highly respected sources that can be very useful for evidence-based practice and thinking through some of these issues. This is sometimes highly respected organizations and reports that they produce. Even if they aren't governmental sources, some of them reach the level of quality that you might consider them as being respected enough that you might use them as a source and citation in scholarly work. There's some governmental web sources, reports, and governmental data that are respected, and sometimes these are data that you need to actually use because you can't find it sometimes from publications. So, for example, the CDC does a survey regularly, the NHANES survey, that looks at health across the entire population, and they put this data up, make it publicly available. And so it's some of the best data that you can get about looking at different health-related factors in the general population. But it's just, you go to a website and you download that data out of the website. You may not go to an actual publication. Now, for some of these higher level governmental reports and data, they sometimes actually are publications. So they sometimes will have, you'll be able to cite those publications because they've actually published it in a journal as well. So you should always look when you're using that type of data. You can sometimes find that there's an actual citation that you can use. And sometimes you cite the reports themselves as governmental reports. In some cases, for these highly respected sources, you can use them as citations in your work. So that's just some an overview of the different types of evidence that's out there that isn't necessarily published by scholarly publications and publishers. So these can be very useful, as I mentioned, for building background knowledge about a health-related issue. And for some of the higher quality evidence that's out there, sometimes it's appropriate to use it in providing insight and sometimes as citations to support changes in clinical practice. All right, so thank you very much for listening, and take care, everyone.